camera opens on a grocery store checkout line. An elderly man, Walter, stands at the counter, slowly counting out coins from a worn leather pouch. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a gallon of milk sit on the conveyor belt. Behind him, the line grows restless. A middle-aged man sighs heavily. "Come on, old man," the man mutters just loud enough. It's not rocket science. Walter's fingers fumble over a nickel, the coin slipping to the floor. He bends down, hand trembling, as the sighing man scoffs. Then from the next lane over, a younger voice cuts through. "I've got this." Michael steps forward, dressed in a weathered military jacket, wallet already in hand. He places a firm hand on Walter's shoulder and meets the crowd's gaze. Without men like him, none of us would be standing here. The store falls quiet. Even the cashier pauses, the scanner still mid-beep. Michael slides his card through the reader. Walter looks up, eyes wide, as the final receipt prints. The camera lingers on the bagged groceries as Michael picks them up, turning to Walter. "Come on, sir," he says, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let me walk you home." Outside, through the window, the rain starts to fall. Walter Henderson was the kind of man you'd easily overlook if you didn't know better. A quiet figure moving through life with a kind of modesty that makes him nearly invisible in a world obsessed with noise. At 85 years old, Walter was a veteran of the Korean War, though few people in the neighborhood knew the details. He never spoke about it, never displayed medals or old photographs, never joined the local veterans group. Instead, he lived alone in a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of town, surviving on a modest pension and Social Security check that barely covered his needs. His wife, Martha, had passed years ago, and their only son lived across the country, busy with a family of his own. Walter's appearance reflected both age and resilience. His hands, once steady enough to handle the sharpest of tools, now trembled slightly when he reached for his keys or lifted his coffee cup. His eyesight had faded. He sometimes leaned in close to read the labels on canned goods or to count out his change. But his posture remained straight, his clothes were always neat, and his shoes, though old, were polished. Walter carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man determined to hold on to the last threads of independence. Neighbors spoke of him with fondness. "Walter fixed our porch steps when they rotted out 2 winters ago." Mrs. Franklin down the street would say, "Didn't even wait for us to ask." "He used to watch my kids when I had to work the late shift," said Monica, a single mother from 2 doors down. "They loved him, always brought them peppermint sticks and told them corny jokes. He never complained," added Mr. Lewis, a retired mechanic. "Even when his hip went bad, you'd see him pushing his mower across the yard. Stubborn old guy." Walter's life was simple, structured, and humble. He kept his routines tight, not out of habit, but out of respect for others. When he went to the grocery store, he deliberately chose the mid-morning hours on weekdays, knowing the store would be quieter, the lines shorter, and his slow pace less likely to bother anyone. He never filled a cart. Instead, he carried a small basket, selecting only what he needed: bread, eggs, a small carton of milk, sometimes apples if they were on sale. His fingers would hover over the price tags, calculating with quiet care what he could afford that week. The cashiers knew him by sight, if not by name. "Hi there, sir," they would greet as Walter approached, and he'd tip his hat, offering a small, almost embarrassed smile. He never wanted to cause trouble, never wanted to draw attention to himself. But beneath that quiet surface was a man who had once seen the harshest edges of the world and had come home determined to live gently. In the war, Walter had carried wounded men across frozen hillsides, sat up nights, tending to injured friends, and faced moments of terror that left a scar deep in his bones. But when he returned home, he chose not to carry those stories like a badge. Instead, he chose to serve his community in smaller ways with his hands, his time, and his heart. And so in the aisles of that small-town grocery store, Walter moved carefully, unnoticed by most, but leaving behind a quiet trail of kindness wherever he went. The checkout line was growing restless. Walter stood at the front, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled through the worn leather pouch in his pocket. A loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, a dozen eggs, and 2 apples sat on the conveyor belt. He had already placed a few crumpled dollar bills on the counter, but now came the harder part, counting out the coins. Behind him, the line had doubled in length. A man in his 40s shifted impatiently from foot to foot, arms crossed, the Bluetooth in his ear blinking softly. His cart was full of snacks and soda, and his fingers drummed against the handlebar. "Come on," the man muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those around to hear. "It's not rocket science." Walter's fingers closed around a handful of coins, but a dime slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. He bent slowly to pick it up, his back stiff, his knees creaking. The man behind him let out a sharp sigh and shook his head. "Gya roi ma kong bie chuan." Bisana, the man snapped with a dry laugh, glancing around as if looking for agreement from the others. A ripple of discomfort moved through the line. A woman near the back shifted her purse on her shoulder. Another shopper pulled out their phone to scroll, trying to ignore the rising tension. A teenager popped out one of his earbuds, sensing something was happening. Walter straightened slowly, the dime pinched between his fingers, and offered a quiet, almost apologetic glance at the cashier. Emily, barely out of high school, gave him a hesitant smile, but she was clearly unsure what to do. She glanced toward the next register, hoping to catch the eye of a supervisor, but the other cashier was busy and the manager was nowhere in sight. "Sir, take your time," Emily said softly, though her voice wavered slightly. Walter gave a tiny nod, focusing again on his task. His lips moved silently as he counted under his breath, lining up the nickels and dimes carefully on the counter. His hands trembled, and now even the simplest math felt like a mountain. The man behind him gave another exaggerated sigh, stepping forward and tapping his foot against the cart. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "This is why I shop online." A few people further back began to murmur. A woman clucked her tongue. Another rolled her eyes and leaned toward her friend to whisper. A little boy in a shopping cart asked his mother why the line wasn't moving, and she gently shushed him. Walter's cheeks flushed a deep red. He reached into his pocket again, but his fingers brushed only lint. He checked his coat pocket, then his other pants pocket, pausing each time, as if hoping a hidden coin might materialize. He looked up, lips parted slightly, eyes flickering to Emily. Emily opened her mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated. She didn't know whether to cover the last dollar herself, whether that was even allowed, or whether to call someone. The line seemed to lean forward, the weight of a dozen unspoken frustrations pressing against the old man's back. Walter's shoulders hunched slightly. For a moment his fingers hovered over the coins on the counter, as if he were about to gather them up and simply leave the groceries behind. The idea of walking out head down empty-handed seemed to hang heavy in the air, just on the verge of happening. The teenager a few spots back had stopped scrolling his phone, his brow furrowed. The woman who had been shaking her head was now chewing her lip, and even the impatient man's bluster had quieted into an awkward shuffle, though he kept his eyes fixed on his phone screen to avoid the looks around him. Emily glanced once more toward the other lane, but the cashier was still busy. The tension stretched brittle and sharp across the length of the checkout line, and for a few long seconds it felt like the entire store was holding its breath. And then, just as Walter reached again for his pouch, one last desperate search for change, he didn't have the sound of a voice cut through the quiet like a knife. A voice that didn't belong to the cashier. A voice from the crowd. A voice that would change everything, just as Walter's trembling fingers reached into his pocket once more. A voice from behind cut through the growing tension. "I've got this." The voice was calm but firm, and all at once the restless line turned its head. Michael, a man of about 35, stepped out from halfway down the line. He wore a faded military jacket, its patches worn, but still recognizable to those who knew. His boots were scuffed, his jeans practical, and there was an easy strength in his walk as he approached the register. Walter froze, fingers still hovering over the small pile of coins. His eyes lifted, confused at first, then wide with surprise, as Michael placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let me take care of this, sir," Michael said with a soft smile. "You've done enough." Walter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His cheeks, already flushed from embarrassment, turned an even deeper shade of red, but his eyes glimmered now with something else, a mix of surprise, gratitude, and disbelief. Michael turned toward the line, raising his voice just enough to carry. "If it weren't for men like him, none of us would be standing here today." A silence rippled down the aisle, deeper and sharper than anything the impatient sighs had caused. The man with the Bluetooth looked down suddenly, fascinated with the floor tiles. The woman near the back, who had been shaking her head, now dropped her gaze, cheeks coloring. The teenager, earbuds dangling, watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Emily, the young cashier, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A small relieved smile crept across her face as she watched Michael slide his card into the machine, covering the entire total in a matter of seconds. The receipt printed, the bag was filled, and the moment, though brief, stretched as if the entire store had paused to take notice. Michael handed the grocery bag gently to Walter, who took it with trembling hands. Still, Walter hesitated, his grip tightening on the bag as his eyes searched Michael's face. I don't know what to say, Walter murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Michael extended his hand, a small grin on his face. No need to say anything. Sir Walter reached out his hand, shaking as he took Michael's in a firm grasp. For a moment they just stood there, two men from two generations, two wars, two lifetimes, and yet in that instant they were the same. Then Michael stepped back and in one simple, practiced motion, raised his right hand in a sharp military salute. Walter's breath caught, his free hand came up instinctively to his brow, returning the salute with as much strength as his body could manage. His eyes were wet now, but he didn't look away. The store seemed to exhale all at once. A few customers gave small nods. A woman near the bakery section wiped at her eye with a tissue. The impatient man at the front of the line shifted his weight, murmuring something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like an apology. Emily, still smiling, glanced at Walter and softly said, "Thank you, sir, for everything." As Michael turned to leave, Walter reached out, his fingers brushing Michael's arm. "Wait," Walter said quietly. "What's your name, son?" "Michael," the younger man replied, his grin widening. "Michael Carter." Walter squeezed his arm gently, his voice thick. "You've done your family proud, Michael." Michael's eyes softened, and for a moment they simply stood together, the weight of their shared experience needing no further explanation. As Michael walked toward the exit, Walter stood a little taller, his shoulders pulled back, his chin lifted. And for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself a smile. Not the small, polite kind, but one that reached his eyes and stayed there, warming the lines of his face. Outside, the automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and Michael stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Inside, Walter turned grocery bag in hand and walked slowly toward the door. The crowd parted for him, not out of pity, but out of respect, and one by one heads bowed slightly as he passed. For a brief, unforgettable moment, Walter Henderson was not just the old man from the end of the street. He was a veteran, a hero. And finally, at last, a man seen and honored by those around him. As the last beep of the scanner faded and the receipt printed, Michael lingered near the checkout counter for a moment, glancing toward Walter, who was still gripping the grocery bag with trembling hands. Emily, the young cashier, looked between the two men, a mix of awe and curiosity crossing her face. Michael offered her a small, knowing smile and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear over the soft murmur of the store. "You know," he said quietly, "that man, he saved my father's life." Emily's eyes widened, the realization washing over her face like a sudden sunrise. Michael leaned against the counter, glancing briefly toward Walter again. "My dad served with him in Korea. I grew up hearing the stories. One night there was an ambush. My dad was pinned down, injured, scared, sure it was over for him, and then Henderson," Michael nodded toward Walter, "came crawling through enemy fire, pulled him out, carried him back, saved his life without thinking twice." Emily looked again at Walter, who was still gathering himself, unaware of the quiet conversation happening, just steps away. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Michael continued, his voice soft but steady. "My dad always said, 'You wouldn't be here, son, if it weren't for Henderson.' I grew up knowing that name like it was part of my family. But the funny thing is, Walter never made a big deal of it. He never came home and played the hero. He just quietly went back to life." Emily blinked, the earlier tension in her shoulders melting into something more tender. Michael smiled slightly, shaking his head in admiration. "I didn't even know where to find him for years. My dad passed away a while back, and I made it my mission to track down Henderson just to say thank you. I searched through veteran groups online, military reunion boards, old contacts. Eventually, his name popped up in a veterans registry. It turned out all along he was just a few miles from here, living in that small house on Maple Street." Emily's mouth parted slightly in astonishment, and today, Michael added with a quiet chuckle, "was the first time I saw him in person." I came in here to grab coffee and some groceries, never expected this moment to land in front of me. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. Meanwhile, at the front of the store, a quiet shift rippled through the other customers. People who had grumbled or sighed only minutes earlier were now glancing at Walter with a new sense of recognition, their expressions softening. A woman leaned over to whisper to her daughter, explaining softly who Walter was. The man who had crossed his arms impatiently earlier now rubbed the back of his neck, eyes lowered clearly, ashamed of himself. Michael turned to Emily once more. You know he's a local hero, but he's been invisible for years. People forgot. Maybe they never even knew. Emily gave a small, thoughtful nod. Well, she said quietly, they know now. Michael offered a small laugh. Yeah, they do. He straightened, glancing once more toward Walter, who now stood at the automatic doors preparing to step outside. Before he left, Walter turned slightly, caught Michael's gaze, and gave the younger man a small, grateful nod. Their eyes locked for a moment, a silent exchange between two men from two different worlds, bound by a single act of bravery that had stretched across decades. Emily watched Michael take a breath and turned to follow Walter, out a faint smile still touching his lips. In that moment, the grocery store seemed to shift. It wasn't just a place of transactions anymore. It had become a place where history and humanity had quietly brushed shoulders, where a long overdue thank you had finally been delivered. And as Walter and Michael disappeared into the fading afternoon light, the store slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But something in the air felt just a little bit different, a little lighter, a little more aware, a little more grateful. As Walter stood near the exit, still gripping his grocery bag and wiping at the corner of his eyes, something remarkable began to happen. It started with a quiet voice near the back of the line. A woman in a blue coat who had been clutching her purse tightly just minutes ago reached into it and pulled out a few folded bills. She stepped forward, handing them to Emily at the register. Please, she murmured, glancing toward Walter. Use this for his next trip here. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between the woman and Walter, then accepted the money with a grateful nod. A young father nearby, holding the hand of his toddler, followed her lead. Add me in, he said, handing over a $10 bill. His daughter, barely old enough to walk, steadily slipped away from his side and toddled over to Walter, wrapping her small arms around the old man's leg without a word. Walter froze for a moment, looking down in surprise. Then almost cautiously, he rested a trembling hand on the girl's soft hair. His face, still wet with emotion, softened into a gentle smile. From the bakery counter, one of the employees arrived with a small box tied with a ribbon. For you, sir, she said softly, placing the box, a fresh loaf of bread and a slice of cake on the counter next to him. Then the store manager appeared, walking briskly from the back office. His name tag read Stan, and his face was lined with the kind of weariness that comes from years of running a busy store. But today his face carried something different. He extended his hand to Walter. Sir, from now on, anytime you need anything. Groceries help, whatever, you come see me. We'll make sure you're taken care of. No charge. Walter looked stunned, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but Stan squeezed his shoulder gently. It's the least we can do. All around, the mood in the store had shifted. Customers were no longer shifting restlessly or checking their watches. They were watching Walter, many with softened eyes, some looking slightly ashamed of their earlier impatience. And then from the man who had been the loudest complainer, the one with the Bluetooth earpiece, the crossed arms. The impatient tapping, came a quiet voice. I feel ashamed, he muttered almost to himself, but loud enough for the people nearest to hear. A woman next to him nodded slowly, her gaze lowered to the floor. Another man nearby gave a small, awkward cough and shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes darting toward Walter and then away again. Near the produce section, two teenagers who had been goofing off moments earlier stood still, watching in wide-eyed silence. One of them slipped off his baseball cap, holding it loosely at his side. The energy in the store had transformed from annoyance to reflection. It was as if everyone present had been gently reminded of something they already knew, but had buried under daily stresses: the value of respect, the power of kindness, the importance of gratitude. Walter, blinking back fresh tears, looked up at Michael, who still stood quietly nearby, hands in his jacket pockets, watching everything unfold with a calm, satisfied expression. Michael gave him a small nod as if to say, You see, sir, they remember. Walter's voice, when it finally came, was thick with emotion. I don't know what to say, he murmured. Michael reached out, steadying Walter's shoulder. You don't have to say anything. As Walter turned to leave, a small crowd formed at the door. Children ran up to hug his legs. Parents offered handshakes, and people quietly pressed gift cards or bills into the cashier's hand for Walter's next visit. For the first time in years, as Walter stepped outside into the afternoon sun, he felt the unmistakable weight of being seen, appreciated, and honored, not for medals or speeches, but for the quiet, steady life he had lived, the sacrifices he had made, and the example he continued to be. And behind him, the little grocery store on Maple Street didn't feel quite the same. It felt warmer, more human, and perhaps just a little bit better than it had been before. Thank you for staying with us until the end of Walter and Michael's story, a story that speaks not just to one moment in a grocery store, but to the heart of what it means to live in a caring, grateful community. Walter's experience reminds us that true heroism often goes unseen. In today's America, where life moves fast and distractions are everywhere, we sometimes forget to pause and look around. We forget that the person quietly waiting behind us in line may have once made sacrifices we can barely imagine. We forget that behind some of the humblest faces in our neighborhoods are stories of courage, resilience, and quiet service. But the deeper lesson in this story isn't just about honoring veterans, though. That's certainly a part of it. It's about how we as neighbors, friends, and strangers choose to show up for one another. Gratitude isn't something we say for national holidays. It's something we live out in small everyday choices, giving up a seat on the bus, helping someone carry groceries, or even just showing patience and respect when someone is moving a little slower in front of us. For older viewers especially, this story might spark memories of a time when neighbors knew each other better, when small towns came together, when respect across generations was a given, not an exception. But for all of us, young and old, it's a challenge to reflect: how do we make sure those values still live on today? Here's something we want to hear from you. Who is the silent hero in your life that you want to honor today? Maybe it's your father, a neighbor, an old teacher, or a friend who has always been there without seeking credit. Please share their name or story in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else to look up and show kindness in their own circle. And here's another question to reflect on. How can we as a society do better in recognizing the quiet contributions around us? Do you think our communities today are more disconnected than they were in past generations? Should we be doing more to teach young people about respect, service, and gratitude? We would love to hear your thoughts and even your disagreements in the comments. If this story moved you, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help us continue to tell meaningful stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the simple, powerful ways we can lift each other up. Thank you for being part of this community. Together, we can make sure that no hero, no matter how quiet, is ever forgotten, and that gratitude becomes more than just a word we say, but a way we live every single day.